In this video, we are going to discuss how to play the Caro-Kann defense with the black pieces, and we are going to discuss a particular variation under the Caro-Kann defense, which is also known as the fantasy variation. Like many of the viewers have already commented me that they want a video on particular fantasy variation, how to play against the fantasy variation. This video is going to be a very interesting and it's a complete crash course of how to play against the fantasy variation. And if you are not yet a subscriber, make sure to subscribe the channel because still 93% of you guys have not yet subscribed the channel. It's free for you, but it helps us to motivate to make more videos like this. So without any further ado, let's start. So we are playing with the black pieces and white starts with 1 e4. We play the move c6, d4, d5. This is also known as the Caro-Kann defense. And today we are going to focus on what happens if white plays the move f3. Like, the idea is pretty simple. White is covering the center by pushing up the pawn to f3. The point here is, if black captures the pawn, white captures the pawn back. So we capture the pawn back in the position. And here, white is having already two moves to continue the position. White can either capture the pawn back or white can simply develop the knight. If, for example, if white captures the pawn, which looks kind of sensible, you are having a complete control of the center. Now we are already going to strike in the center via playing the move e5, which is a very interesting move. After e5, the idea is pretty simple. Like, if white tries to capture the pawn, we are simply going to give a check, and now followed by capturing the e4 pawn, and black is already better. So going back, capturing the pawn is already a bad idea. So white's main move is to play the move knight to f3, developing the knight, attacking the pawn on e5, and also developing the protecting the pawn. And basically the point here is, we can't really capture the d4 pawn in the position because white is having a very strong move, bishop to c4, developing the bishop, and now white is having just a ton of compensation for the lost pawn. White can simply short castle, even sacrifice on f7, and white is already having a better position. So that's the whole point. Capturing the d4 pawn is already a bad idea. So at the place of capturing the pawn, we play the move bishop to g4, which is a very sensible move. We are pinning up the knight and not allowing the knight to capture the pawn. So here, after bishop g4, white is already having three moves to continue the position. White can simply capture the pawn with the pawn. White can play the move c3, or white can even play the move bishop to c4. So first, discussing what happens if white plays the move bishop to c4. Developing the bishop, which makes the maximum sense. You are focusing on developing your pieces. Here we are already going to play the move knight to d7, and here already white is still having three moves to continue the position. White can play the move h3, c3, or white can even short castle. All the three moves make tons of sense. So here first, focusing on what happens if white simply short castle, simply focusing on developing his pieces. Short castle, we are going to play the move knight to f6, because already white's idea is to capture on f7, king f7, knight g5, followed by capturing the bishop because it would be a check. So after knight to f6, white is having two moves to continue the position. White can play the move c3 or even bishop to e3. The idea is to protect the pawn on d4. If white starts with c3 first, we are going to play the move bishop to d6. And usually the idea of c3 is to get the queen to b3. So here, white is having again two options. White can play the move queen b3 or bishop to g5 is also an option. So if bishop to g5, developing the bishop, we are going to play the move h6, attacking the bishop. And after h6, like, if bishop goes back, we can already play the move g5, bishop g3, queen e7, and after knight d2, already long castle, and we are already having a very comfortable position. Black is already having a good play on the king side. We can just need to push the pawn, and black is already better. So going back, that's exactly happens if bishop goes back. If the bishop decides to capture the knight, the idea is to simply capture the bishop back, pawn takes, and already we give a check. King moves, queen takes, and here we already captured the pawn on e4, already knight f2 is coming up, and black is completely winning. So going back, bishop g5, not the best. Coming to the main move, if queen b3. After queen b3, it makes a lot of sense because white is attacking the f7 pawn, and at the same time attacking the b7 pawn as well. So after queen b3, we play the move, first short castle, protecting the pawn, giving up the b7 pawn, and now already capturing the knight on f3 because the knight is usually very annoying because it is covering the e5 and also protecting the d4 square. So whereas the bishop on g4 is completely useless, so it's the best idea to capture the knight for the bishop. Rook takes, and here comes the best part. we capture the pawn and play the move knight to g4. What's the idea? After knight g4, we are simply attacking the pawn, and kind of after h3, we play the move knight to c5, a very interesting move. What's the idea? The point here is, if white simply captures the knight in the position, we simply capture the pawn, simply coming with queen to d4, like it's kind of unstoppable mate, rook f1, check, simply capturing the bishop, and it's completely winning for black. So coming back, after knight c5, if white somehow decides to capture the pawn now, at the place of capturing the knight, we can already play the move bishop to h2 check, kicking the king and already capturing the pawn on d4. And it's still one move made, so you kind of have to go back with the rook, and now already just getting the rook, capturing the pawn, and the point here is if you capture the queen, it's already a mate. So like it's completely winning position. If at g4, you can still give a check, capture the rook, and it's completely winning. So that's why this particular variation after somehow queen into c6 is completely losing for white. So going back, this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays c3. Going back, what happens if your opponent plays bishop to e3, developing the bishop. After bishop e3, you play the move, first capturing the pawn now, bishop takes, and now bishop to c5. The idea is to simply trade one pair of the bishop. And here after bishop c5, black is already better because white's pawn structure is already bad because white is already having an isolated pawn. So like for example, after takes, this pawn is weak and black is already better. So going back, this is exactly what happens if white decides to do a short castle. Going back, what happens if your opponent plays the move c3 in this position? The idea is pretty simple. White is defending the pawn with the idea of queen b3. So after c3, we develop our bishop to d6 because, for example, if we develop our knight, here white is having the move queen b3 and we want to play the move queen e7 in order to defend the pawn, but the bishop on f8 is kind of trapped. So that's the whole point. We are first developing the bishop, and after queen b3, now queen e7, and here if white decides to capture the pawn, rook b8 takes, and already we first capture the knight because, as I said, the knight is actually pretty annoying piece. Takes, develop the knight, and after, for example, takes, bishop takes, and the point here is if white decides to play bishop e3, we can already short castle, and black is pretty happy because black is having already tons of compensation in exchange of like a 1 or 2 pawn down. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop e3. If white push the pawn to f4, attacking the bishop, already short castle, sacrificing the bishop, attacking the queen, capturing the pawn, the king is extremely exposed, short castle, and the finishing touch, rook b6, the game is over. Just the rook slides in, queen h4, the game is over. Black is completely winning. So that's exactly what happens if white decides to capture the pawn. If white decides to do a short castle in the position, we play the move short castle, knight to d2, developing the knight. We simply play the move rook b6, attacking the queen, and the point here is to get the rook into the game. Queen goes back, pawn takes, and already bishop sacrifice, knight h5, and already after rook f2, queen h4 check, knight f4, the rook is coming in, the king is extremely gone, and it's completely winning for black. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent decides to capture on b7. So now discussing what happens if your opponent decides to play a short castle in the position. The idea is pretty simple now. Kind of white wants to capture the pawn, takes, and there could be simply knight moving, attacking the king. So first we capture the knight, and here after, for example, if rook takes, we develop our knight, queen takes the pawn, short castle, queen takes the pawn, and now already we capture the pawn. Knight to g4, attacking the h2 pawn, takes, knight takes the pawn, attacking the rook and the queen, and it's completely losing after queen c5 check because you can't do much. For example, if bishop e3, our idea is already to capture the rook, giving a check, capturing the knight, capturing the bishop, and black is already winning. You can just count the material. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the bishop with the rook. If the opponent captures the bishop with the pawn, we first develop our knight, queen takes pawn, and the point here is we are simply short castling because we are just giving up the poison pawn in exchange of focusing on our development, short castle, and if the queen goes back, we simply develop our knight, attacking the bishop, getting our rook in, and black is already pretty happy. The idea of black is to already play knight h5, takes, followed by bishop sacrifice, queen h4, rook d6, getting the rook into the game, and black is already winning. Or at least black is very comfortable. So if white gets greedy and goes for capturing the pawn on c6, we play the move rook c8, attacking the queen. Queen goes to h6 and already pawn takes, and now knight to b6, attacking the bishop. The bishop falls back and now comes the move knight to d5. What's the idea? Our idea is to play the move knight to b4. So first, white has to capture, and now we can already capture the bishop with the rook. Takes, giving a check, and the idea is to simply capture the rook in the position, and basically the queen side is simply paralyzed. No piece can move. White's king is extremely weak and black is completely winning. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent simply decides to do a short castle. If your opponent decides to develop your bishop to g5, which is already a bad move, you can already play the move knight to f6, knight to g2, and already get some compensation with b5, h6, g5, grabbing more space, short castle, knight h5, and black is pretty happy because white pieces are all just went back, and black can be the one to just start seizing the initiative in the position. So black is pretty comfortable. That's what exactly happens if your opponent plays c3. If your opponent plays the move h3, which is not the best, you can already capture the knight, queen takes and give a check, provoking g3 and now simply coming back to f6. And the point here is, if white decides to do a short castle, you can already trade off the queen, knight to f6, and black is pretty happy because if you take, I want to simply capture this here, rook here, and now already bishop b4 is winning, and like it's completely winning. So going back, short castle is not the best. If your opponent plays the move queen b3, attacking the f7 pawn, and the idea is to play the move rook f1 and putting maximum pressure over here. First we can play the move b5, and after rook f1 we can already capture the bishop because the point here is if rook takes we can simply capture the queen, and black is already winning. Black is a piece up. So that's what happens if your opponent plays bishop to c4. So going back, now discussing what happens if your opponent plays c3. In this position after c3, we are going to develop our knight, bishop to d3, we develop our bishop to d6, short castle, knight to f6. Like this is the most common setup you can get in the fantasy position. And after a4, what's the idea? After a4, white's idea is just kind of stopping black from playing the move b5. And white's idea is to play the move knight to d2, knight c5, knight c4, attacking the bishop. So first, we are going to play the move bishop c5, bishop to c7, a good prophylaxis move. And the point here is after knight d2, we want to play the move takes, and now knight to c5, attacking the bishop. If you take the knight, I can capture the bishop. So you have to pull back the bishop, and already knight d6, putting pressure over here, knight b3, capturing the knight, bishop b6, attacking the pawn. And the point here is after bishop e3, we are having this knight g4, and suddenly white's center is collapsing and black is winning. So going back, that's why a4 is not the best. If white plays knight to d2, and now usually in the history, the game continued with a short castle, knight c4, bishop c7, and after bishop g5, white is kind of better in the position. But after some changes, at the place of short castle after knight d2, first we are going to play the move b5, stopping knight c4, and after something like h3, we can already pull back the bishop, a4, first a6, protecting the pawn, g4, bishop goes back, knight h4, simply short castle, and if knight f5, we can already capture the knight, and if we capture with the rook, I can first play h6, stopping the move g5, and after bishop c2, I can already push the pawn, and push the pawn to c4. Now what's the idea? Black's idea is to play bishop c5, knight e8, knight d6, and black is pretty happy. So kind of the move c5 is kind of a move that actually comes in this position pretty often. So you must be careful about this particular c5 move. So going back, that's exactly what happens if rook takes. If white captures with the pawn, we can play the move queen b6. The idea is still to push the pawn or even to capture the pawn. Knight to f3 and still c5, and black is pretty happy. If we push the pawn, c4 check, and black is completely winning. So that's exactly what happens if knight f5. If knight into g6, we simply capture the knight back, knight to f3, and now here we are simply going to play rook b8 to defend the pawn, and now the idea is to play the move c5. So like king g2, c5, c4 with the same idea, and already b4, getting some good play on the queen side. Already we can capture the pawn, push the pawn. The bishop on c2 is completely dead piece, and black is pretty happy. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays c3. Now going back, what happens if your opponent decides to simply capture the pawn? If white captures the pawn, we can already play knight d7, because if we try to capture the queen in the position, thinking that white has already lost his castling rights, now it's extremely hard for black to capture the pawn on e5. For example, after knight g7, like white can already play h3, and if you go back g4, and black is already protecting the pawn. So you kind of have to give it the bishop pair, pawn takes, and already f4, you can already say white is having the bishop pair, having a good amount of center, and white is already better. So why give this privilege to white if at the place of doing all this weird stuff, we can already play the move knight to g7. And what's the idea? We are attacking the pawn, and the point here is if something like bishop f4, already knight e7, knight g6, and we can get the pawn back. So white has to play bishop e3, queen c7, and now we can already capture the pawn back without any efforts, and black is already pretty happy because white is already having an isolated pawn, and black is better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight to f3. Now going back, what happens if at the place of capturing the pawn on e4, white develops the knight? If after developing the knight, we can already capture the pawn, takes, and already knight to f6. Now this position is already pretty good for black, because like white is having two moves, bishop d3 or bishop to c4. If white plays any of the moves like bishop c4, now we play the move bishop to f5, because bishop g4 is not really working, because after takes, knight g5, it's a check and white wins. So going back, that's why we put the bishop to f5 in the position, and after, for example, if knight g5, we play e6, g4, we simply play the move knight to d7, a very interesting move, because if gf5, we can already give a check, capture the knight, because the knight cannot be captured because the bishop is hanging. So the bishop goes back and already a check, knight falls back, and if you takes, simply taking with the queen, and black is pretty happy. So that's exactly what happens if white takes the bishop. If white plays the move knight to d3, we can simply pull back the bishop, h4, b5, b4, basically putting the knight at an awkward place, and now bishop e7. And the point here is if h5, we can start with a check, and black is already pretty winning. Like bishop over here, we can already take, and black is pretty happy. So that's what exactly happens if knight d3. If short castle, we can already play the move knight takes, and the point here is you lose a piece, because if you capture the knight, I can simply trade out the queen, capture the pawn, and black is winning. So you kind of have to capture the bishop, but I can simply capture the bishop, takes, pawn push, and black is a piece up and winning the game. So that's exactly what happens if short castle. If white plays the move knight into d7, we can already give a check, capture the pawn, and now on the next move capture the knight, and black is winning. So that's exactly what happens if knight e5. If short castle, e6, and now knight e5. Now what's happening? White's idea is to capture the bishop and capture the pawn on f7. So first we have to play bishop g6 in order to stop rook f5. Bishop g6, now bishop g5, knight to d7, and black is already happy. Like queen e2, bishop e7, black is going to short castle, and black's position is already rock solid. And if after knight d7, if white takes, and goes for capturing a pawn, already after bishop g7, black is completely winning, because black is having the bishop pair, and the position is completely winning. So going back, that's exactly what happens if bishop to c4. If white plays bishop to d3, we can now play the move bishop g4, because now there is no longer bishop f7. So bishop g4, short castle, e6, and now black's idea is pretty simple, bishop e7, knight d7, short castle, and black is pretty happy because black is a pawn up. So that's exactly how you can play the fantasy variation under the Caro-Kann defense with the black pieces. You can just watch this video if you're not yet clarified with any particular variation, because it's a bit lengthy variation, a lengthy video, but I've successfully covered the complete crash course of the fantasy variation. So if you learned anything new today, make sure to like the video, share this video with everyone, and make sure to subscribe to our channel if you are not yet a subscriber. If you want any particular video on any particular topic, tell me in the comment box below. I'm going to give you the complete notation of this particular video in the description below. You can just go and check it out. Thank you for watching and bye bye.